Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I am doing my March reading wrap up. I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of March, what I thought about them, as well as my statistics and things that maybe complicated my reading in the month of March. But first of all, if you are new here, I post new book reviews almost every single day, so if that sounds interesting to you, feel free to stick around. Now let's jump right into my March 2024 numbers. So in the month of March overall, I read 13 books, and while that probably seems high to a lot of people, and it probably is higher than average, please keep in mind that I am a very avid reader and I read every single day right before bed, so my numbers do get quite high. However, those 13 books did surprise me for reasons I'll discuss in a minute. Of the books that I did read, 42% were fiction and 58% were nonfiction. I do tend to overall have a very even 50-50 split between these two. So 42% fiction, 58% nonfiction did feel right for me. My average rating was 3.85, so around a little under a 4-star, which again feels right. I rarely read anything below 3 stars because I usually have a very good feel for books that I like, and this month was no exception. I had no books that I rated below 3 stars, and I did have 1 5-star review. So overall, it was a very good reading month. And according to Storygraph, which is where all these statistics come from, I read 3,121 pages. Although at least one of these was an audiobook, so the page count is a little different. The 13 books did surprise me this month because my March was very, very busy. And again, while 13 seems like a lot to probably most people, I usually would expect me to read a little bit more than that. However, in the month of March, I played on 2 basketball rec teams, 1 volleyball rec team. I attended 1 bachelorette weekend. I had 1 whole Easter weekend. I had the wedding to attend for the bachelorette. I'm not sure if I said that. And I took a road trip for an entire week to a different part of the United States that I don't live in, and I am impressed that I got anything done at all in the month of March. So with all of that being said, I read 13 books and I'm very impressed, and I was actually surprised. I was expecting a much lower number than I had. So overall, I felt very good about my 13 books, and we're gonna talk about them in 2 categories. First being fiction, second being nonfiction. So let's dive in and just quickly go through all the books that I read in March, what I thought about them, and a brief little summary in case you are interested. Most of these are reviewed on my channel. Fiction, the first book that I'm going to talk about, and these are not in order that I read them in March, was Monthly in the Garden with My Landlord by Yorokawa. So this was a book about a woman who rents an apartment and the landlord comes with it, and there's a romance element. I felt like it was kind of a slow start, but I do expect manga series to have a slow start, so that wasn't too surprising for me, and I feel like it still had a lot of potential. Second was My Pancreas Broke, But My Life Got Better, and this was by Kabi Nagata, who wrote the very, very popular manga autobiography, My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, I believe is the title. I actually haven't read this one, but this manga, autobiographical manga, details, why did I put that as fiction? That's nonfiction. It's autobiographical and it details her struggle with alcoholism, or her struggle with alcohol abuse after becoming a published author, writing My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness. Next up is the continuation of a series I read. This is actually a webtoon that's being put into like a print format. It's The Remarried Empress, volumes 4 and 5. So just a continuation of that series. I am loving it. I'm not sure how many other people enjoy that series, but I have really been enjoying it. Next, I had a short story, The Blue Behemoth by Leigh Brackett. This was a short story that I read in the ebook format. I love Leigh Brackett as a sci-fi writer. She was more not affluent, but she wrote a lot more in, I believe, the 30s or 40s, 50s, 60s, that time frame. And I read her Hugo Award winner, The Long Tomorrow, excuse me, which really kicked me off a spree of reading her short stories. Next was an audiobook I listened to, and it was one of my first forays back into middle grade, which I really haven't read since I was an early teen. That was Tamora Carter, Goblin Queen. This was by one of my favorite authors, Jim Hines, who I have read his Janitors of the Post-Apocalypse and his Goblin Quest book, so I decided to try his middle grade fiction. It was enjoyable, but again, I'm not the target demographic because it is middle grade fiction. The audiobook was good, the story was good, but I think again, it's just viewed for or geared for a little bit of a younger audience than I am. The final fiction book was A Stroke of the Pen by Terry Pratchett. This was a collection of lost stories that have been uncovered as being written under a pseudonym by Terry Pratchett at the beginning of his career. It was a fun little collection. I laughed out loud while reading it, and I think if you like Terry Pratchett, you'll see his writing style in this collection of short stories. So I do recommend getting that if you're a Terry Pratchett fan, or if you just want to read some funny sci-fi, not really sci-fi or fantasy, just some fun short stories. They are fantastical, but they tend to be set in the here and now as opposed to Terry Pratchett's later Discworld creation, and they just have fantastical elements in the current world. But A Stroke of the Pen was really good, one of my favorite ones that I read this month. Now diving into nonfiction, with the exception of My Pancreas Broke, But My Life Got Better, which I accidentally put on the wrong list in my notes. Nonfiction. First is Mysterious Patterns and Infinity. This is by Sarah Campbell. These were little kids books that I got and read because I wanted to see how these topics of fractals and infinity would be presented to kids. So I felt like reading them was a really good experiment in how you could present a math concept that becomes quite intense to little children, basically. And it was fun, even though of course I'm not the target demographic for reading those sort of books, and they were quite simplistic. I do recommend checking out my reviews on those if that is interesting to you. Next is Paved Paradise by Henry Graeber. This was a book that discussed parking in the United States and how parking influences how cities look. I really enjoyed this book, and it was an audiobook, so it was a good, fun listen. I promise that it's more interesting than it sounds. I know you say I'm reading a book about parking or I'm listening to a book about parking and it doesn't sound very interesting, but it wound up being very fascinating, and I'm very interested in how cities are laid out and what makes a good city to live in. Parking is a massive part of it. If you live in the United States, we are a very car-dependent culture in most of the United States. So hearing or reading about how parking influences a city and how we can do things with parking right now that will make cities better or more attractive or better utilization of space. I really enjoyed that audiobook. Next is, did I really read this book? Vampire Forensics by Mark Jenkins. That must have been at the beginning of the month. I'm just looking off the list that I got from Goodreads. That was a book on vampires. I did read this one in March. I read it at the Bachelorette weekend. I'm so fun. The Vampire Forensics was a book that kind of discussed vampire legends and lore and maybe tried to bring forward scientific explanations for these phenomena that come up in mythology. I thought it was enjoyable. I felt like it was a good companion to the field guide book on vampires that I read in February. So the two books kind of went hand in hand. I still haven't quite found the vampire book that I'm looking for that really dives into the more academic detail of vampire legends, mythology, folklore, without going too academic. I'm still looking for that sweet spot. I'm still looking. So if you have a recommendation, please put it in the comment section below. But Vampire Forensics was quite interesting and did contain quite a bit of information that was, again, a really good companion to the field guide, which was more just a list of legends that I read back in February. Next is Fukushima, the story of a nuclear disaster. This was a discussion on what happened in Fukushima. I did find the book had a little bit more of a US focus for something that happened in Japan. I think the title or maybe the advertising or marketing of the book could have been a little better to indicate this was mostly about how the US responded to the disaster in Fukushima. But I think the story was overall pretty good. I was inspired to read this after just thinking and realizing about how much I didn't know about another major nuclear disaster that occurred in my lifetime following the Return to Fukushima photography collection that I read earlier. I believe it was this year or late last year. So that inspired me to read this. And to follow up that Fukushima book, I also read EGF this month, which was another manga autobiographical book, which was written under a pseudonym, so not the author's real name. And I think it really addressed an important part of nuclear disasters. When I read a book about nuclear disaster like Midnight at Chernobyl or Fukushima, the story of a nuclear disaster, the focus really tends to be on the disaster. What happened hour by hour, minute by minute, this went wrong and this went wrong and this overflowed and this boiled over and then there was a meltdown. And what really makes a nuclear disaster bad is there's a lot of cleanup afterwards and things are quite radioactive. So the EGF is written from a worker's perspective who goes in and cleans in the radioactive area. So that was a really interesting book. I heard someone downstairs and I really enjoyed that worker's unique perspective. The final book that I read in March was Euler's Gem by David Richeson. This was a book that introduced topology through a particular polyhedra formula, and it was a very interesting book on mathematics. If you enjoy math, you'll probably enjoy Euler's Gem, and I had a great time reading it, although it was quite dense and I did take quite a bit of time to read through it. So that was my March. I really enjoyed the month. I read a lot of great books. I had a really high rating, and I want to hear what you read in March. So please, please, please put what you read in March, what you thought about it, what your favorite books were, what you rated them in the comment section below. I love to hear it. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.